Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our forum on building emissions. My name is Julie Ty, and I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. We're happy to be joined by our event partners at the Saban Center for Climate Change at Columbia Law School. We also want to thank our sponsors, AECOM and Con Edison. NYLCV Education Fund's mission is to educate, engage, and empower New Yorkers to be effective advocates for the environment. This forum is the second in our series of New York's ambitious Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or CLCPA, building on an event we held at the Saban Center last fall. That first event provided a 10,000-foot overview of the all-encompassing law to move to a green economy. Through this series, our goal is to build public awareness and educate New Yorkers on climate policy, as well as identify recommendations for how to achieve its objectives in a way that is efficient and equitable. We held our first forum in this series in 2020 in August, focusing on offshore wind transmission. We'll hold more in the future to talk about transportation, manufacturing, and natural resources and agriculture. One of the most important steps we can take to cut emissions that contribute to climate change is to reduce emissions from buildings, the #1 contributor here in New York City. To address this, the New York City Council passed Local Law 97 last year, which will require certain large buildings to meet emission reduction standards. The CLCPA also legally commits New York to this priority, with a mandate to achieve economy-wide carbon neutrality across all sectors, including buildings, by 2050. And for those of you who missed our first forum on wind energy transmission, don't worry. We have that posted online and it will be available for you to view. Now, the building sector is more complicated to regulate than the power sector. We're an old state with old infrastructure, so energy efficiency measures must address things like decades-old boilers. The challenges vary greatly between buildings in a major city like New York and buildings across other parts of the state. The city has an entire cohort of commercial buildings that demand huge amounts of electricity during the weekdays, but stay empty at night and on weekends. Well, at least that's how the city operates during normal times, which someday we might return to. The high-density apartment buildings, which may still use old HVAC systems, also have vastly different types of energy needs than small houses that can upgrade their systems more easily. Even considering these challenges, there are many opportunities to improve our buildings' efficiency. Government programs like the New York City Retrofit Accelerator help building owners navigate through the system if they want to implement efficiency measures like upgraded lighting, new insulation, or new windows. The green jobs that will be created to install these new energy efficient systems will also provide good wages for families across New York. Real estate stands at the ready to advance renewable energy technologies for buildings. And we've worked with them this year to help address that, advance those issues moving forward. That's what we're here to talk about today. This forum will look at our different strategies and perspectives for how we green our buildings. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the first panel. Stephanie Margolis is the Executive Director for the New York City Climate Action Alliance, a nonprofit whose mission is to help create a carbon neutral, resilient, and economically vibrant city through deep civic engagement and collaboration. In this role, she works closely with commercial tenants and building owners to achieve deep energy retrofits and determine the most effective suite of resources that will enable stakeholders to meet zero carbon goals. Prior to joining the Alliance, Stephanie worked with cities throughout the US to craft sustainable urban redevelopment strategies and supported EPA's Energy Star program. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to the New York League of Conservation Voters for hosting this panel. I am incredibly excited to introduce all of my panelists. We'll go ahead and read a quick bio on each of them, and then we will dive into questions that we have pre-prepared, and then we'll open it up to the audience and take questions from the audience as well. So joining me on today's panel is Zineb Bouzaba from the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability. Zineb is a policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability, where she works on data analysis and equitable policy development related to achieving an energy efficient, carbon neutral building stock. She manages the carbon trading study under Local Law 97 and works closely on the city's greenhouse gas inventory. Zineb has a Master of Public Policy from the University of California at Berkeley and bachelor's degrees in Math and Environmental Sciences and Engineering from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Also on today's panel is Sophie Cardona from Nyserda. As Senior Project Manager on Nyserda's as Senior Project Manager on Nyserda's Efficiency Solutions team, Sophie manages the commercial tenant program, working closely with commercial facilities and tenants help them identify energy savings opportunities, reduce their energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. He is also involved with a series of building decarbonization initiatives and manages behavioral demonstration projects to test alternate behavior-based solutions to drive changes in energy consumption patterns. Prior to joining Nyserda, Sophie worked in various capacities to advance green retrofit programs in the multifamily and residential sectors in New York City, build environmental literacy around issues of waste management, toxics reduction, and conservation of natural resources, and assist buildings to gain LEED certification. She has a background in international economics and sustainable economic development, as well as interior architecture and space. Dan Egan from Vornado is the Senior Vice President of Energy and Sustainability at Vornado Realty Trust, a real estate investment trust with over 30 million square feet of office and retail properties concentrated in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Dan's team published Vornado's Vision 2030, which roadmaps the company's commitment to carbon neutrality. Dan works to curate effective relationships with Vornado's tenants, communicating energy goals with them, and discovering best practices that can be repeated in tenant spaces. Dan serves on the boards of the Building Energy Exchange, the REBNY Sustainability Committee, and is co-president of the New York Energy Consumers Council in New York City. He is a member of various working groups for climate legislation for both New York City and New York State. He is also vice chair of the Real Estate Roundtable Sustainability Policy Advisory Committee. The next panelist is Amy Turner from the Saban Center for Climate Change Law. Amy Turner is a senior fellow at the Saban Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, where her work focuses on the laws and legal tools cities use to achieve their climate mitigation commitments. Prior to her work with the Saban Center, Amy was the executive director and a co-founder of the New York City Climate Action Alliance, and she continues to serve on the organization's board of directors. She practiced environmental and transactional law for 10 years at Davis, Polk, and Wardell, Milbank, and in solo practice. Amy graduated from Middlebury College and from Harvard Law School, where she was an editor for the Harvard Environmental Law Review. She is secretary of the board of directors for the Brooklyn Greenway Initiative and was formerly a co-chair for the New York City Bar Association's Committee on Environmental Law. And lastly, we have Jason Volan from AECOM. Jason is the Vice President, National High Performance Buildings Practice Leader and Director of Architecture for Metro New York, AECOM. In his multiple roles at AECOM, Jason focuses on leveraging the intersection of energy, finance, and policy to deliver high performance and sustainable design solutions that reduce both capital and operating costs. Jason's work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and the American Institute of Architects. He has won numerous awards for next generation building systems design and has multiple building system patents under review. Jason was recently selected to serve on the Energy Grid Working Group to assist the advisory board for Local Law 97 as part of Mayor Bill de Blasio's Green New Deal. So please welcome me in joining our panelists on today's discussion. Now we're going to kick off with some questions, and Amy, I'm going to start with you to help set some of the context for the discussion we're about to have today. So can you please go ahead and set the policy landscape in New York City around building emissions by discussing Local Law 97 and what it requires?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stephanie. So Local Law 97 is New York City's fairly sweeping law intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the city's largest building. So the bulk of the law is in the form of what's called a building performance standard, which is just what it sounds like. It's a requirement that buildings achieve a certain metric of performance rather than a requirement that buildings take prescriptive steps that might be identified in a law. So in this case, to be more precise, the requirement is that the city's buildings over 25,000 square feet have to meet or comply with a carbon cap, a limit on their greenhouse gas emissions. And that limit will start in 2024 and then ratchet down to a more stringent cap in 2030 and likely to more stringent caps in the years beyond that. So each building is essentially assigned an emissions limit based on its use categorization and its size, its square footage. And then building owners have the whole gamut of tools that they can use to meet their emissions cap. They're not prescribed certain measures that they have to take. Energy efficiency retrofits and other building improvements are, of course, a big piece of what will be needed to comply with Local Law 97, although building owners will have some other tools at their disposal. In the first compliance period, which runs from 2024 to 2029, building owners can purchase offsets for up to 10% of their greenhouse gas emissions allowance. During both compliance periods, building owners can purchase RECs for renewable energy projects that feed directly into New York City's area of the electric grid. And it's possible that building owners will be able to trade carbon credits across buildings. Local Law 97 requires the city to study carbon trading, which I trust we'll hear much more about from Zina, but it doesn't actually require or authorize any carbon trading system. So we'll learn more in the new year as to whether there will be a carbon trading emissions, and perhaps Zina will give us a preview today. So there's a pretty steep penalty for non-compliance with Local Law 97. Penalties are authorized up to $268 per ton of carbon above and beyond a city's emissions limit. That's sort of a high end of the range for penalties, but they are authorized to be that high. So the first compliance period that starts in 2024 is set at a level where approximately 20%, the top 20% emitting buildings will actually have to do something to comply, whether that's retrofit or upgrade their buildings or purchase offsets or trade emissions credits or however they choose to comply. To put another way, 80% of buildings over 25,000 square feet are already in compliance with the 2024 standards. But then the 2030 compliance period sort of flips that a bit, and the top 75% emitting buildings will actually have to take some action to comply. So I just want to say one final thing about Local Law 97, which is that a lot of attention was paid to which buildings would be subject to Local Law 97. The law, of course, applies to buildings greater than 25,000 square feet, but certain types of buildings, and in particular, residential buildings with one or more rent-regulated apartment or unit are subject to an alternative compliance pathway that imposes certain prescriptive measures, smaller scale upgrades to a building rather than the emissions cap. So the exemption from the emissions cap portion of Local Law 97 for rent stabilized buildings stems from some complicated legal interplay with New York State rent regulation, which has now changed. And so there's been some movement towards revising Local Law 97 such that buildings that are comprised of fewer than 35% rent regulated units would now be subject to the main performance requirements rather than the prescriptive requirements that currently all residential all rent regulated residential buildings are subject to. So the bill is currently in committee. The City Council is considering it now. It's Intro 1947. They've held a hearing, but to my knowledge, they have not scheduled a vote. So that is just one change that we could see to Local Law 97 coming in, the upcoming weeks and months.
Thank you for providing that context. It really does sound like Local Law 97 is unprecedented and a generational opportunity to transform building level emissions in New York City. So a follow-up question to you, Amy, is how does Local Law 97 compare to other such laws outside of New York State?
Yeah, so when you're talking about laws in place to require existing buildings to decarbonize, only a handful of US cities have the kind of robust building performance standards that New York City has or will have in Local Law 97 starting in 2024. So, and really like Local Law 97, the more sweeping of these building performance standards have requirements that don't kick in for a few more years at least. A few examples: St. Louis will require buildings over 50,000 square feet to meet an energy use intensity standard starting in 2025. Interestingly, the standards in St. Louis will get more stringent every 4 to 6 years, and they'll have to be set at a level that essentially requires requires 65% of covered buildings to update each cycle. So that's pretty incredible that more than half of all covered buildings will have to upgrade every 4 to 6 years, with some exceptions. Washington, D.C. has a forthcoming building performance standard. It'll start kicking in with buildings 50,000 square feet and above, and by 2030, I believe, we'll ratchet down to buildings 10,000 square feet and larger. So that's a bit more sweeping than Local Law 97 in that respect. Washington State also has a building performance standard coming into effect in the next 6 to 8 years. Reno, Nevada has one in place, but it offers prescriptive pathways as well. So it's not a pure building performance standard. Building owners can meet the performance or prescriptive pathway. And then a handful of cities have kind of smaller building performance or retrofit requirements. Austin, Texas, for example, has its Energy Conservation and Disclosure Ordinance, which requires poor performing buildings to implement energy efficiency improvements. Boulder, Colorado has a rental efficiency standard. So essentially, landlords for residential buildings are required to meet a certain efficiency standard through a performance or a prescriptive pathway in order to get a rental license. So they can't rent out the apartments they own if they don't meet these standards. And then, switching from existing buildings to new buildings, I think that's where some other cities and states are doing really interesting things, namely in the building energy codes, which is sort of the most readily available tool for new buildings. So many cities and states have been adopting codes, as New York has, with increasing energy efficiency requirements. There's been some advocacy around getting the International Energy Conservation Code, which most states end up adopting to include more stringent energy efficiency measures. Some of the more, path-breaking cities and states include things like electric readiness or solar readiness requirements in their building energy codes. These are requirements that buildings be wired for all electric appliances or for solar panels at some point for future use. And then many cities in California are actually requiring that new buildings be all electric, so no fossil fuels. This is the so-called municipal natural gas ban that you may have read about in Berkeley and other cities in California. And then some states like Massachusetts have a stretch code where municipalities can adopt a more energy efficient code than the base code. So, I think there's a long way to go for cities and states in the country to get anywhere kind of near the needed level of performance for new buildings, but the building code is a well-used tool, and a number of interesting options can be attached to it.
Thank you, Amy. So Sophie, my next question is going to be to you. So now that we've heard about Local Law 97 and the requirements facing building owners moving forward, can you describe some of the technical assistance that's available through Nyserda for commercial buildings?
Sure, thank you. There's several options that we have at Nyserda to work with building owners as well as commercial tenants to really help, buildings sort of strategize around how to reduce their energy consumption and their carbon emissions to respond to Local Law 97, but then also obviously beyond Local Law 97 as well, right? So let me just quickly define what we mean by technical assistance. Basically, a series of activities that can support the decision-making process with respect to energy efficiency and energy management. And that can include a host of things. It can include, just doing your basic energy study and assessment. Could include, providing expert advice on different types of technologies and equipment upgrades, calculating energy and cost savings, which can, be very complicated analytical models if you're taking into account sort of what can happen in the future, and then demonstrating the feasibility, both technical and economic, of an efficiency project. So the flagship, technical assistance program that we have at Nyserda is the Flextech Program. I think a lot of people have, might have heard of the Flextech Program. It's been around for, I think, almost 20 years. And for good reason. It's been a very successful program, and it's basically a cost shared energy study program. And through that program, we can provide funding between 50 and 100% funding to cover the cost of an energy study. Typically, those studies are of sort of whole building systems, but they can also be targeted to specific systems And the program is flexible enough that it can, again, support many different building owners and occupants in, really trying to pinpoint and identify opportunities for energy savings in a commercial building. I'll say, though, that the Flextech program was recently modified to also be able to support energy efficiency evaluations of multifamily buildings as well. So it's not just limited to commercial facilities at this point. So like I said, the cost share ranges between 50 to 100%, depending on the type of facility, depending on the type of study. But again, the Flextech program is flexible, hence the name, to be able to support, anything from sort of a basic walkthrough audit of a building to a study, a very sort of complex and comprehensive study, which might look at energy storage, distributed energy resources, renewables, etc. We have another technical assistance program, which is the commercial tenant program. It's structured in a very similar way than Flextech. It's a cost shared energy studies program, but it is, what makes it stand apart is that it's targeted, as the name implies, on tenant spaces, commercial tenant spaces specifically. And the reason for that is because we know that tenants consume more than 50% of all the energy consumed in a building, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there to be able to work with tenants, engage tenants, to try to reduce those loads and make those spaces more energy efficient. So again, this is a cost shared study program up to 100% cost share. And we can work with both building owners and tenants in this program, which also is a little bit different than the Flextech program, which especially with respect to Local Law 97, has been, I think, very relevant because more and more building owners are now realizing, and have known all along anyway, that in order to be able to really make a dent in their emissions reductions, they need to engage the tenant. And I think that Dan is going to be talking about that a little bit later. So again, that tenant engagement piece is definitely very important, and that's what we try to get to with the commercial tenant program. I'll also mention briefly, there is another program at Nyserda which is aimed at small businesses. It's the Green Jobs, Green New York Energy Studies program. So if you're a small business with 100 employees or less, or a nonprofit organization, we do offer heavily subsidized energy studies. And actually, until the end of the year, the energy study is completely free. And this was, sort of our one of the things that we did in terms of responding to COVID-19, to try to support the small business sector. So through that small commercial audit program, you're going to get a comprehensive walkthrough audit. You're going to get utility bill analysis, and then you'll get an evaluation for low and no cost measures, as well as capital measures for your facility, and a report that kind of outlines all of that. And then through that program, you can also receive some financing if you choose to install some of the measures. So those are sort of the three main technical assistance programs that we have at Nyserda. I'll just mention, Nyserda definitely handles the technical assistance part, and then for implementation incentives, that's a bit of another conversation, but I would encourage anybody to really go look at Con Ed, because Con Ed is offering some very, very rich incentives, both for small businesses as well as large commercial buildings.
Thank you, Sophie. It was great to hear about all of the different programs that Nyserda is offering to commercial buildings, residential buildings, tenants. So now, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you a question about what you think are some of the most promising abatement measures that commercial building owners and tenants can implement today to improve energy efficiency.
Sure, happy to talk about that. Just want to do a sound check. Is my audio is coming through okay? Okay, great. So, absolutely. I think that I want to start with a comment that about Local Law 97, in that they rulemaking process is between now and 2023, and there will be several additional compliance details that will become known, which actually may be pretty influential as to how building owners may achieve compliance. But I do think the one thing's for certain right now, I think energy efficiency is undoubtedly an abatement measure for Local Law 97. So the less energy you are consuming, the further, you can reduce your exposure to this law. And I think that it is not to oversimplify it, but it is certainly something that's actionable today that you can move forward with great confidence that it will reduce your exposure and your potential costs and penalties in the future for these buildings. I saw a first question. I have the Q&A window up in front of us as well. And just to clarify, so the energy cap requirement absolutely includes all of the energy that's being consumed in the building. So it does include tenants, it does include different condo units, and the ownership entity is on the hook for all of the energy being consumed within a building, whether the owner landlord has direct control over that energy or not. And so, we have really ramped up our engagement with tenants on energy efficiency, because not only have we been doing that anyways for several years, but it's, this is truly going to be a measurement of everybody's behavior and performance in a building, and not just what is within the direct control of the landlord. So to just give a few abatement measures, this is not going to be, we could talk a lot about smart buildings and IoT and very sophisticated measures, which are obviously out there. But I don't want to sort of pass over the very basic low and no cost solutions that I think we take for granted have not really been fully implemented in New York City. So let's not forget about lighting retrofits and motor replacements and variable frequency drives. Those are, sort of the fundamentals of doing more with less energy through either a Nyserda or Con Edison program. There are incentives, whether for the research to look into the solution or the implementation installation that can help with the project economics. There are improvements you can make to your building envelope, whether that is glazing, weather stripping. We find a lot of value in damper replacements, and so understanding how that can impact just the overall performance of the envelope, as well as reducing HVAC loads in your building. There are automation programs. So if you have a larger building, like many of Vornado's, we have building management systems that can automate different components of the mechanicals to not only, from an efficiency perspective, permanently reduce the energy being consumed by our systems, but also enable our ability to curtail upon demand. So participate in demand response and reduce our demand, whether permanently or during periods of constraint on the grid, which we certainly has value today, but we think will continue to increase in value going forward, particularly as the grid makes its transition to zero carbon. On the tenant side, in our buildings, which are, primarily commercial office buildings, tenants are in control of lighting and plug load, supplemental HVAC, and my favorite, IT loads. What we're finding is in a pre-COVID world, the best opportunity to influence tenants and the equipment that they've, procuring for their space is at the time of the lease. We try to make sure that we are part of the conversation as the tenant does their space planning. We make sure we introduce our tenant to Sophie Cardona, for example, at Nyserda, to make sure they're aware of the commercial tenant program and other opportunities, certainly through Con Ed. And then on an ongoing basis, I think larger tenants in particular who may have their own facilities management team have opportunities to perfect their O&M, operations and maintenance, and make sure they're running the space very efficiently. I don't think anyone will be surprised that many people leave the lights on. I mean, it's a very simple thing that I don't think people realize has a very deep impact across the city. So I'll pivot for a moment to this era we find ourselves in right now, which is COVID, with a primarily work from home environment, which means that there's very few people in our office buildings right now. couple observations. One is that there is a largely inelastic relationship between occupancy and energy consumption. We're seeing that there's a very large fixed component of energy consumption that remains in place even when folks are not in the office. And as we sort of peel away at that to understand what is behind that fixed component, what we're realizing is even our leading tenants who are making sure the lights are off, making sure the plug load and the supplemental HVAC is programmed to be off when nobody's there. To support the work from home environment actually requires a good deal of 24/7 energy from an IT perspective. And I think that there's an enormous opportunity going forward to take a closer look at how businesses support the remote workforce and how that can be done more efficiently. I think back in March, it was a very rushed transition from, everyone in the office to everybody home. And not surprisingly, I don't think energy efficiency was was top of mind during that transition. I also don't think folks thought that, we'd be going on 8 or maybe as long as maybe 18 months of working from home and understanding what the lasting impacts are of leaving the lights on or leaving the desktop on. And not only from a cost perspective, what does that mean for energy and for carbon? And so, we're making sure that we're getting that message out to our tenants, but I think that this community online ought to get that message out, to their respective businesses and take a closer look at what is actually happening back at the workplace. While, even looking on this screen, I see I'm the only one in the office, but I do work in commercial real estate, so that's probably where I belong.
Thank you, Dan. It's interesting to hear about all of the different, or it's exciting to hear about all of the different abatement measures that are out there. It's interesting to understand how COVID has been impacting energy efficiency in commercial buildings, and we do have a question dedicated to that coming up in a little bit. Zainab, I'm going to turn to you now and ask you a few questions about carbon trading. As Amy indicated, it's not written into Local Law 97, but the city is exploring it right now. So can you talk a little bit about the project that you're advancing in regards to the city's carbon trading study, and generally how carbon trading might be used to meet the requirements of Local Law 97?
Yeah, definitely. So first and foremost, I think the city recognizes that the emissions caps set by Local Law 97 are ambitious. And so in order to incentivize complying, we have devised a study to investigate some alternative compliance pathways. And that's what the carbon trading study is doing first and foremost. So the carbon trading study is mainly an exercise of modeling. So the meat of the study, which is the phase that we're in right now, compares as a baseline emissions and energy cost savings against the world of building performance and GHG emissions under Local Law 97, absent a carbon trading program. So we're really looking at the incremental cost savings, incremental emissions reductions, and a few other important measures that we're looking at as well, that I'll talk about a little bit more later, I hope. But the carbon trading study's stated goals are, one, not only to offer an alternate compliance pathway that would help lower compliance costs for Local Law 97 for building owners, but we also hope to develop strategies to leverage a carbon trading system that drives investment in environmental justice communities, and then ultimately propose a marketplace design and governance recommendations for a carbon trading design, but one that allows for increased market transparency and eases the burden of compliance, especially for DOB, who's going to be overseeing all of this.
So a follow-up question to you. You had indicated that one of the goals of the carbon trading study is to understand how carbon trading can be leveraged to drive investment into environmental justice communities. So can you speak a little bit more towards that, and how can trading potentially drive investment into environmental justice communities?
Of course, yeah. So first and foremost, we want to acknowledge that a lot of environmental justice communities and Environmental Justice Alliance official stance is against any market-based solution towards carbon emissions reductions. So we are aware of that. We acknowledge it. There have certainly been carbon trading programs in the past based on our research, and also anecdotal evidence indicates that a lot of carbon trading programs, or just trading programs of any kind that have been implemented, oftentimes had inadvertent effects on not included groups and historically burdened communities as well. We are taking that information and integrating it into our study, and we hope to learn from those experiences to make this program really a pioneer program, first of its kind. We definitely want to center these concerns in every single step of the study process. So specifically to answer your question, carbon trading would provide a potential source of revenue or investment for these buildings that may not have existed otherwise with just local law 97, by being able to trade credits depending on how these credits are allocated and the design specifics of the program. Buildings might have access to some capital to make energy efficiency investments in their buildings that they might not have had access to otherwise. In addition, because we are specifically looking at levers for investment opportunities in environmental justice communities, we hope to have not only encourage buildings and environmental justice communities to participate in carbon trading, even though they might be subject to the prescriptive measures list, because there might be an additional source of income that might not have been available otherwise. But we are also looking at any potential source of revenue that would be directed, that would be generated through the carbon trading program and directed directly towards environmental justice communities as well.
Thank you, Zineb. I know that we're all very excited to see the results of the study, and I know it's an ongoing process, and results won't be ready until next year, but excited to see what the city finds and whether carbon trading can be a mechanism to reduce compliance costs and help drive investment towards environmental justice communities. So Sophie, another question for you, and we did begin to touch on this in Dan's last response, but I do want to pose to you questions on how COVID is impacting the built environment and leasing in New York City. And so how is, in your experience, how is COVID impacting energy consumption in buildings, and are there any emerging best practices for addressing indoor air quality while still paying attention to energy efficiency?
Getting myself off of mute. So yeah, we are actually in the process of studying this very question. So I'll just start right off the bat by saying that there aren't at this point definitive best practices when it comes to sort of balancing energy efficiency and IAQ, indoor air quality, that's COVID safe. We are so precisely in the process of investigating this question, and we're doing it through the Flextech program, where there are about 37 studies underway that are being conducted by 11 Flextech consultants that were competitively selected to do this work, to again shed light on what are these best practices when it comes to having a COVID safe building and being able to run it in an optimal way. So again, these studies are looking at, you know, exactly what is the impact on building operations with this sort of improved IAQ that everyone is aiming for to make sure that buildings are healthy. Some of the, I mean, I can speak to some of the solutions that are being investigated in these studies to give folks a sense of you know, what those best practices might kind of revolve around. So obviously ventilation is a big one, right? So increasing airflow. This can even just include opening windows, right? I mean, that's what they're doing at my daughter's school. They just have the windows open all the time and they just tell the kids to wear lots of layers, right, in case it gets cold. I mean, obviously that we can't do that in our high-rise buildings in Midtown Manhattan, but anyway, ventilation is a big one. And obviously, you know, that's where you get that trade-off between, you know, increased, you know, sort of better IAQ, if you will, more air flowing through buildings, and then having that be a negative impact on the energy efficiency side. So ventilation is definitely something that's being investigated in, I think, pretty much all of the studies. Filtration is another big one. So again, you know, installing filters that are capable of filtering out, you know, small particles, you know, and then those filters can have different ranges of efficacy. So MER filters, HEPA filters. There's also a whole series of solutions that are being investigated around HVAC control improvements. So again, you know, how can those controls be more automated and allow for reliable responses to changes in IAQ demands while limiting the amount of energy that that is being required to do that. You know, and that includes time of day scheduling, demand control, ventilation, et cetera, et cetera. Another big one that's being investigated that's garnered a lot of interest is UVGI, so ultraviolet germicidal irradiation technologies, which again are intended to destroy germ particles and microbes by applying an ultraviolet light either to a surface or to an airstream. And you know, different sort of configurations of that are being is being investigated in these studies, including, you know, putting these UVGI technologies in the ducts or in the air handling units or in the upper in the upper section of a room, right? You can't put UV light on people; it's not good for people. So again, you know, sort of 8 feet and above. There are also different portable UV sources that are being investigated, as well as, you know, looking at how UV technology can be utilized in elevators, make elevators safer as well. And then there are other solutions that are also under investigation. One of them is humidification, which might not be applicable for all facilities, but again, maintaining a relative humidity level between 40 and 60% has been found to be the optimal humidity range to limit the transmission of most disease-causing particles. So that's part of the solutions mix as well as energy and heat recovery. So, you know, heat taken from exhaust air is transferred to incoming outdoor air in order to limit the additional heat that's needed to condition greater amounts of outdoor air coming into buildings. Retro commissioning, you know, tried and true, is just making sure that your systems are tested, that they're inspected, that they're repaired, replaced, that they're working the way that they're supposed to, can also go a long way to make sure that that building systems are working optimally. And then there's another, you know, sort of one that's gotten a lot of buzz, which is bipolar ionization. And this is a technology that is included in the investigations that are happening, but they're not directly funded through Nyserda because it's you know, it's a little bit out there, I guess, for Nyserda to feel comfortable funding, directly funding. But this is you know, looking at how reactive ions can be introduced into the airstream in order to neutralize bacteria and viruses and other particles. So, you know, even though we're not funding that portion of the study, the results will still be included in the final results that come out of these studies. We're posting monthly updates as they become available on the website. And I'm happy to circulate a link if anyone is interested afterwards. But I guess, the main takeaway is these studies are ongoing, and we haven't been able to pull out best practices yet, but that is the aim of these studies, is to be able to really kind of look at these studies that are being conducted, and I forgot to say this, in a variety of different facility types. So we have studies in commercial real estate, in hospitals and museum and transportation facilities, in schools and colleges and universities. So the hope is that once we start to get more robust results, we can better understand sort of what is that new baseline, if you will, that can help you get, COVID safe, if you will, IAQ measures in your buildings, and sort of making sure that that's balanced with energy efficiency, so that we can run these buildings as energy efficiently as possible while also making sure that they can be safe.
Great, thank you, Sophie. I would say, as with being excited about seeing the findings from the carbon trading study, I am sure everyone is excited to see the monthly reports posted for these projects to better understand what some best practices could be. So just want to point out that we're aiming to wrap up here around the top of the hour, and then we'll turn it over to a second group of panelists. And we are still hoping to get in. We have a few more questions, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. And so we're excited to continue to run through the rest of this. Now, looping in Jason, I want to ask you about so we've heard from Sophie, what are some existing resources? We've heard from Sophie about Nyserda's program, and want to open it up to you to understand what other existing resources are there to help building owners and tenants reduce energy.
There's a few out there that exist. PACE financing is certainly available, and it's an important mechanism. It's been around for a little while, and certainly coinciding with local law 97, I think we'll probably see that grow again in popularity, because it's a good mechanism based on a sound intersection of finance and policy and technology upgrades, right? So those three things, when you put them together, usually mean that you can find a financial mechanism to improve things. Energy savings performance contracting, in some ways, very similar to that, and that can be done on system by system, or it can be done in whole. From our experience, when you start thinking systemically, that we're talking about large, broad systems, the more you can wrap into that, the more it makes sense. So, for example, if you change to ground source heat pump, your payback may be 45 years. That's really pushing the limit. It certainly goes well beyond a typical tenancy, and often the ownership of a building, or the lifespan of many components of a building. But if you wrap in solar and lighting and water and envelope, you might get that down to 20 years. And 20 years is a number that usually you can get financing for. So thinking broadly in looking at the mechanisms that we already have allows you to do more with more. And I think that's a way that we can approach it. Another part of this is challenging the demarcations that we've typically put between owner and tenant. So we have, for either very good reason or tradition, separated that tenancy between who is taking care of what. There are some companies starting to challenge that line. Energy doesn't recognize that boundary. Climate does not recognize that boundary. We impose our boundary on those geological time-based systems, we'll always be fighting it, and we'll always be in an incremental stage. So another way to think about it is, okay, what if we have more of a partnership model, and you could grow that partnership model to include public and private, so tenancy, owner, and public institutions, and say, how would we rethink that energy flow through the building differently, and how it affects the climate broadly? Local Law 97 is a nice broad swath. So it already says, let's think a little bit more broadly about the city together. And it forces the conversation, as Dan was saying, between the tenant and the owner. In this case, if you start challenging that boundary and you say, there are only a few options we're going to allow in this building, but we're going to do a few things that make that worthwhile. We're going to improve the indoor air quality so that your tenants are healthier, so that they have reduced absenteeism, so they have better executive functioning and make better baseline decisions. But that comes at a little bit of a cost, but it's going to be less cost than the value you're going to get. You now start to see a different type of thing when we look at that systemically. So if we focus on one small thing, we'll make one small improvement. But if we look broadly at the systems and start challenging what we have, and particularly now is a very good time, even though we're in a situation, right? And the situation will change, there'll be other situations, but maybe this is a great opportunity to challenge the way we've already been operating. The second part of that is buildings are funded at a significantly lower order of magnitude in research as to other disciplines and market sectors. And that is something we all can make a step towards arguing for, that we need more money in the system. Nyserda needs an order of magnitude more money to be able to fund more programs, right? And in the past, Nyserda, you funded some of my far-right ideas, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to have partaken in those. So that's something we also need to do too. We need to get more research dollars in here so we can think a little bit differently, because solving the question today is really important, but thinking the next 30 years is probably the most important thing we can do.
Thank you, Jason. So Dan, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and hoping that you can speak to the role of commercial building owners and tenants when it comes to improving building efficiency. And so from your perspective, what are some of the biggest barriers to getting tenants to make changes in their spaces?
Sure. And I actually I wrote down the phrase challenging demarcations, because I think that's key. I mean, that's like something that we're constantly thinking about between landlord and tenant. So to start, we have as part of this Vision 2030, we have this roadmap towards carbon neutrality. We argue that the most meaningful component of that, certainly today, is an energy efficiency goal. So we have a 50% energy efficiency goal below a 2009 base year, because that's looking back, that's when we started our programs. And we're about halfway there today. But of that goal, that is a whole building energy goal, and we have a tenant track for that. So we would like our tenants to contribute a 45% reduction goal on their respective energy. And so that kind of helps us frame the conversation with our tenants about why we're asking them to do anything. I think that COVID in particular has given us a huge opportunity to really stress test how our engagement has been working with the tenants. So I also saw a question here in the Q&A about the best platforms for corporate tenants to use to evaluate their emissions. 95, 96% of our tenants are sub-metered off our main building electrical feeds. So we are able to provide with them on a monthly basis, not just a sub-meter bill, but we've enriched that document with a GHG conversion, with hyperlinks to resources, whether it's EPA, Nyserda, Con Edison, the City of New York, the State of New York, on links to environmental policy. We give them a relative ranking of their, how efficient they are compared to other tenants in the building, or compared to other tenants across our portfolio that are in a similar industry, so they can get some sort of sense of their performance against others. And so I think that as bland as a sub-meter bill may sound, you actually have the potential to make it a very dynamic communication tool that they have to pay attention to at least once a month, because they do have to pay the bill. But also, intrigue them with interesting information that could further that conversation. During COVID, we've been engaging with about 25, 30 of our best and brightest tenants that we have existing relationships with. My sustainability group does, with weekly reports on their consumption, and helping them understand how their present day consumption compares to a prior baseline pre-COVID, and encouraging them, there's very few people in your office. Are you sure that you've done everything you can to reduce your energy consumption? That's been met with a very wide range of success. But I will say overall, that group of tenants, I mean, we just did the math on this and felt pretty good about this. That group of tenants is doing twice as well as our average tenant across the portfolio. So we're seeing a true impact of this sort of tireless effort of my team to just constantly put this information in front of them, have conversations and so forth. I will say, that being said, there are still tenants who don't even respond to the email. This is just not top of mind for everybody, and not every tenant has the resources available, whether it's facility management or a sustainability person, to really pay attention to this. But, we still have even recent examples in the last couple of weeks, tenants who have been getting this information for almost 8 months now that are suddenly waking up. I don't know why, I'm not on their side of the conversation, but they're paying attention, and it's still a worthwhile effort. I do, and just these challenging demarcations. I'll throw out a couple of examples of historical, the culture of real estate that I think if we can break down these barriers, we can do a lot better. Are larger tenants that have their own automation system. Sometimes it's a matter of sharing data, sharing set points, so that we can see the performance of perhaps variable air volume systems and help them, tweak that so that they're actually not calling for as much air from our system, regardless of whose dial this energy consumption ends up on. But it's just a little more awareness and visibility and data exchange so that our systems are talking to each other. That's incredibly vague of me to describe it that way, but it's a huge barrier in place in tenant spaces. And so yeah, I mean, I think again, this is all built on very basic fundamentals of data, providing information, consistency, and transparency with your communications. And I'm happy that we did the math recently, because it's encouraging that these efforts are actually worthwhile.
Great. It is great to see there are certainly barriers that are preventing certain tenants from engaging in retrofits, but it's very exciting to see that when you can make connections, improvements are happening. And so Jason, last moderated question for you is, what are some gaps in strategies and programs, and what are other solutions that the city should consider to improve energy efficiency?
Well, I'd like to extend the idea that energy and climate do not recognize the way we separate the property lines, the way we separate tenancies between the tenant and the owner. They recognize something completely different. And the more we align to that, the better. For example, we have a wonderful temperature stabilizing dynamic mass that surrounds, we are a coastal city that surrounds it. I think there are maybe 2 to 3 buildings taking advantage of that today to help them manage their comfort. There is, our city we see as a heat island effect as negative rather than a giant heat sink or thermal battery. So there's ways where we're not thinking about what we now have to consider an a priori condition of the city is the city, and we have to take it for what it is. And the water around us and how we might be able to manipulate that. There is some discussion about, well, if we engage in that, we have to study what's happening in the water, the biological community, except climate change is already doing that for us. So it's really difficult for us to see that we should not be engaging. And the other piece of that is, we talk a lot about efficiency, but really nature doesn't see efficiency as something it values, it sees effectiveness, right? So it's how in a competitive space do different communities survive? And in this case, what we're trying to do is be competitive about how we can reduce our energy costs. We have to think about effectiveness, which means we have to think about different owners trading energy. That's where carbon trading may be just the beginning of where we might think about something like that. How we can begin leveraging resources where we can't put renewable energy on the top of the city, but boy, there are seas of parking lots surrounding the metro area. So there are other ways that we can leverage those things. And I don't think there's one good way, right? They're all good ways right now because there's no silver bullet. So collectively and there's fracture stakeholder base, just like this panel here coming together, more of that has to happen for these types of conversations.
Thanks, Jason. So now we have just a few minutes left, and so I'm going to open it up to some audience questions. And Amy, I'm going to start with you. We have one that we received regarding Local Law 97, or a few that we've received regarding Local Law 97. How would a rooftop solar installation that does not directly service the building, for example, a residential co-op, would count towards Local Law 97 compliance?
So it absolutely could. What would need to happen is that the energy generated by the rooftop solar installation would need to serve Zone J, which is New York City's portion of the grid, which it almost certainly would. And then you'd need to work with a company that can provide renewable energy credits for the energy that's generated, and then you could use those credits to comply with your obligations under Local Law 97.
Thanks, Amy. So Zena, we have one for you related specifically to environmental justice communities, and that is, what is the range of funds estimated that can be made available to environmental justice communities?
That's a good question. That's something that unfortunately is very hard to predict at this stage. So we're just going to have to stay, keep everyone posted on the results of the study to make sure that an estimate comes out, which will probably happen next year at some point.
Great. Thanks, Zineb. So Dan, this one's for you. And thank you for answering some of the questions as you went throughout your initial answers. How has the pandemic, or has the pandemic with working from home slowed down employer leasing of high performance space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no secret that there's a slowdown in leasing happening right now, and lots of people questioning the future of the workplace. We had a very exciting win with our Facebook lease at the Farley building at 730,000 square feet. I think that was not just good news for Vornado. I think that was just great news for anyone in the business to see to see signals like that, that long-term folks are still, thinking about the workplace and valuing it for its, the opportunities it lends employees. I do think that we're seeing more intelligence around understanding a building's exposure to local law 97. Particularly if you have a 2025 penalty on the horizon, that definitely means we need to be having a capital improvement discussion right now about, what can we be doing to the building to reduce its energy consumption and reduce that exposure. 2030 is certainly out there, and there's some, scary numbers attached to it. But I think there's some moving pieces there in terms of carbon coefficients that, Amy made mention of earlier. But I do think that exposure to local law 97 could certainly impact, the underwriting of loans for buildings. It certainly, it assists the discussion of the value stack for energy efficiency. So should be known that, when we are now looking at energy efficiency projects, we're not only looking at, reduction of utility costs, and if Nyserda or Con Edison want to subsidize some of the costs with an incentive, but in addition to that, avoidance of local law 97 penalties is a true economic component of the value stack for energy efficiency that we are 100% including in our analysis. And then to draw from Zineb's conversation, if we have a building that doesn't look like it has penalties in 2030, and we're still considering an energy efficiency project, we're thinking about, the monetization of a carbon credit there. So, if the project is going to further reduce a building's performance below a local law 97 cap, that's something that could potentially be traded, applied to either another one of Vornado's buildings or somebody else's building, and that will have financial value. So all of these components need to come together for the value stack, and I think it will encourage property owners in particular to reach a little bit deeper into their pockets for energy efficiency, because these ROIs and paybacks are actually not as long as they may seem if you really take into effect all of the different economic benefits.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan. And I want to thank all of the panelists for this discussion this morning. It's exciting to hear all of the retrofit opportunities that are out there, the unprecedented nature of local law 97, and it's exciting to know that we have our work cut out for us, but that there are opportunities to move forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Julie, who will announce a second round of panelists for this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and to all of our panelists. I think that was a really great discussion that we just had, and we're looking forward to our next discussion with our second panel. Our moderator is Bill Nowak, who has been Executive Director of the New York Geothermal Energy Organization, or New York GEO, since its inception in 2014. New York GEO is the trade association for geothermal heat pump installers, drillers, manufacturers, and other stakeholders. And he was recently named to the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel for New York's Climate Action Council. Before that, he worked as Director of Policy for the New York State Senate Environmental Conservation Committee, and as an organizer for the Communication Workers of America, among about a dozen jobs over the course of his career. So Bill, thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate this opportunity. I want to express appreciation to the 100 people who are on the line with us here. This is a great turnout and indicates some great interest. We are going to run through a series of questions, and we hope to have some time at the end for question and answers. Our task is to talk about upstate buildings and addressing the climate emergency through making the New York climate law, the CLCPA, actually work in the field. We're going to do things a little bit different. I'm going to identify the panelists right now, but I'm going to do a little bit of their bio before each one's question instead of doing it all up front. On the panel is Donovan Gordon, who is the Director of Clean Heating and Cooling for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or Nyserda. We have John Shabako, who's President of Aztec Geothermal LLC and a board member of New York Geo. Marvin Church, who is the Senior Energy Advisory at Comrie Enterprises LLC and a board member of the Westchester chapter of the New York League of Conservation Voters. And Sarah Berger. Sarah's the Sustainability Planning Manager at Push Buffalo and focuses on their Push for Clean Heat campaign. So I'd like to direct our first question to Donovan Gordon. And Donovan is the Director of Clean Heating and Cooling for Nyserda. He leads New York State's efforts to develop markets that support renewable, high efficiency, and clean thermal systems. He's also tasked with developing and implementing educational, workforce training, and marketing outreach initiatives for scalable growth for clean heating and cooling technologies, partnering with public, private, and academic institutions. Donovan received a bachelor's degree in business management from St. Francis College and a master's in business administration from NYU Stern School of Economics. So welcome, Donovan. Our first question for you is, how do clean heating and cooling solutions fit with the need for New York State to meet its emissions reduction goals as required by the CLCPA? Donovan, you're on mute.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
I can, great. Okay,
fantastic. First of all, thank you for the opportunity. I like the cat behind you. I was going to say the cat got your tongue, but you're talking well. So first of all, the CLCPA codified some goals that the governor had put in place, several years ago, and it is the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals of any major economy. And I'll state some of them, not all of them. I have some of them listed, which is to reduce our carbon emissions below our 1990 levels by 85% by 2050. That's the long-term goal. The interim goal is to reduce the carbon emissions by 40% from my 1990 levels by 2030. So that's what we're really marching towards. A couple other milestones that will lead up to that. Last year, the Public Service Commission issued a new Efficiency in New York order with several goals, really energy efficiency and MMBTU reduction goals for 2050 by 2025. And out of that emerged three different things. One, again, was the overall policy, New Efficiency New York. Second was the New York State Clean Heat Incentive Program that's managed by the utilities. That's about $454 million. And then Nyserda is managing the New York State Clean Heat Market Development Plan, which is about $230 million. So lots of monies, and one of the really important goals, because we're talking about electrification, 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040. So that's sort of the umbrella of where we are, and now it's codified in law. Now, how does heat pumps, clean heating and cooling fit in within that? We're fundamentally changing the economy of New York State from a fossil fuel-based economy, which in 2016 was probably in excess of $50 billion, with more than half of that money leaving the state. We don't drill for oil, we don't drill for gas in the state, to a clean energy economy, where and a third of the carbon emissions in New York State comes from the HVAC systems of buildings. So really, in order to achieve those aggressive goals of 85% and 40% by 2030 and 2050, we have to decarbonize our buildings. Right now, specifically for heating, we use fossil fuel-based systems. We heat with either oil, propane, or natural gas, which is the most dominant source of heating our buildings. We're burning a fuel on site, which creates the greenhouse gas emissions. Heat pumps, we need to transition now from these combustion-based heating systems to heat pumps. Heat pumps do not create heat. They transfer heat from one place to the other, from the air, from the ground, from the water. I love when Jason earlier talked about using the water around New York City. Boy, oh boy, fantastic. You know, I'll add one other thing, wastewater as well too. So by using electricity to power the heat pumps, so once the grid is clean, you know, we're using solar and wind and battery storage to power these heat pumps, we will no longer need to utilize fossil fuels and burn fuel on site heating. So clean heating and cooling fits directly into the CLCPA. It is a major piece of it. So now I talk about the goal for 2030. We are developing and in the process of developing a roadmap, building an electrification roadmap that will give us policy recommendations and other initiatives that we should undertake to achieve the 2030 goal. And we're also embarking on a carbon neutral roadmap, which will look out to 2050. The building electrification roadmap looks out to 2030. The carbon neutral roadmap looks out to 2050. But what I will stop by saying, one thing I will say is all roadmaps lead to electrification. Electrification of the heating system and electrification of transportation. I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Donovan. The next question is going to go to John Shavacco. He's the president of Aztec Geothermal LLC and often serves as a resource to building owners, developers, construction companies, engineers, architects, and investors regarding the latest renewable energy efficiency technologies, government incentives, and financing options. He's a member of the New York Geo Board and chairs the educational sessions at the annual Heat Pump Conference. Recently, he was appointed to the New York State DPS's Department of Public Services Strategic Advisory Group for Building Electrification to help guide policy and regulations needed to meet energy and climate goals for New York. He's an IGSHPA certified geothermal installer. He received his BS degree in mechanical engineering from Union College. And John, my question to you is, building owners, New York State, and ratepayers have only so much money to spend on cutting greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. How do you suggest we allocate resources between weatherization and heat pumps for getting to net zero emissions?
Great. Thanks, Bill. People can hear me?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, so Donovan had a great lead in there. The CLCPA is kind of the local law 97 got a lot of play in the first session. The rest of the state, we do think about some of the milestones and long-term goals set out by the CLCPA, which also New York City, of course, is under as well. The taking combustion out of buildings is the most important thing we can do for buildings. And if we do that with heat pumps, with efficient electrification technologies for heating and space heating and hot water, then we'll be able to, as the grid gets cleaner, and by 2040, we're supposed to have 100% clean electricity. An initiative that's put in now, if we electrify the heating section of a building, so the furnace or the boiler is replaced by a heat pump, either an air source or a ground source heat pump typically, and the hot water is either straight electric if you don't have much use, but there's heat pump alternatives for that, both air source and ground source versions. That will alone, just a ground source heat pump will take out, which is a lot of math to it, but it's straightforward. About 80% of the site energy is reduced with that single initiative. It's a big initiative. It's a big project oftentimes, but it'll take out the amount of energy that's needed to go to that site. It becomes electricity instead of a fossil fuel that's delivered, either natural gas, propane, oil typically. It's a major reduction. And then as we electrify the balance of that, we can get to 100%. So if the goals are to get to net of 85% in the state, well, we get there fast with a ground source heat pump. Air source heat pump, terrific too, especially downstate where the climate is more friendly to them. 60% reduction in site energy. And if that single initiative, that means we don't do any air sealing. Now, why would we do air sealing and insulating? That's intuitive to everybody. That almost seems like the best place to start. And I would argue that it's the best place to start if the heat pump can't satisfy the building comfortably, or we don't have access to variable speed technology. And what do I mean by that? When almost all air source heat pumps, mini splits and different types of air source heat pumps have this variable speed component to them where they can basically load match. So they run very efficiently when it's temperate out, and they run less efficiently as it gets colder, but they're always adjusting, so their average is quite good. Some ground source systems do that too. If we put one of those systems in right now, there's this concept of get a building heat pump ready. We need to get certain buildings heat pump ready because we can't make them comfortable with heat pumps in their current state. But if we put a heat pump in a building and we can make people comfortable and we air seal and insulate more extensively over time, we've cut out 80% oftentimes of the energy and carbon contribution that goes along with that one initiative, and they get more efficient as we air seal and insulate. So it's just, I think that the traditional building envelope community, which is generally thought of as energy efficiency, but heat pumps are also a major initiative for energy efficiency in reducing the energy a building needs. If we air seal and insulate a building and we reduce its energy consumption by 50%, that's heroic practically for an existing building. But again, that same thing can happen to 80 to 60% for air source and 80% for ground source with a single initiative. So we really need to work together. The heat pump providers and industry need to work with the energy efficiency and envelope providers and find the right balance of those solutions, because to get to an 85% reduction, we can't air seal and insulate our way there. We have to get rid of those combustion sources at some point. We can get rid of them sooner rather than later if we use variable speed technology, I would submit.
Thanks, John. Thank you. Next question is for Marvin Church. Marvin has had an illustrious career in government, banking, transportation, real estate, community development, housing, and energy. Bit of a Renaissance guy. He's a founding member of Comrie Enterprises, LLC, and a consultant firm where he works as a senior energy advisor. He has worked with both Nyserda and utility programs, including Con Edison's low-income energy program. He's a staunch advocate for energy resources for low to moderate income communities and communities of color. Marvin's a member of the League of Conservation Voters Westchester Chapter Board, an advisory member to the New York GEO organization, and a member of United Nations Association Westchester Chapter. He's a co-founder and board member of Environmental Leaders of Color. He has a BS degree in finance and management from SUNY Albany and an MBA from Clark Atlanta University. And Marvin, our question for you is, can you talk about your work in Westchester, specifically around passive housing developments for low and moderate income communities?
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me.
Yes.
For a long time in Westchester County, there's been no push for passive design for the low to middle income communities. For the most part, Westchester County is a wealthy county, but we do have our poor and a lot older residents. The LMI community residents largely reside in Mount Vernon, Yonkers, New Rochelle, Portchester, Greenburgh, and White Plains. In recent years, there's been a surge of new multifamily developments, especially in southern Westchester County. However, few of the newer buildings cater to low and middle income residents. There is one building that is newly constructed in Mount Vernon that meets the requirement of the passive design project in the low to middle income category. Another developer is proposing a passive design for workforce housing. The big issue for the lower income residents is the rents are unattainable. And in newer buildings where passive design is preliminarily incorporated, rents are even higher than the existing rental buildings. New construction for multifamily buildings and developers are stacking the buildings with multitude of amenities that bring the cost beyond the reach of many residents to the low to middle income residents. Since COVID pandemic, we have seen New York City residents flee to areas north. This has left many unrented apartments in New York City, and the impact of rental market in New York City and Southern Westchester is we feel that the rents may fall. In this case, low to middle income residents might find places, including passive house builders, where they can find affordable rents. Since there's a gas moratorium in Westchester County, new multifamily developers are looking at their building, heating and cooling in different ways and are becoming more open to newer energy technologies. As an energy consultant, I've been receiving more requests about the different types of energy systems for newer buildings. Now, the opportunity might exist for the new developers in Southern Westchester who will incorporate a comprehensive energy plan with heat pump, geothermal, passive design, gray water, and it's also known as district systems, which is the heating and cooling communities.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you, appreciate that. Our next panelist is Sarah Berger from Push Buffalo. Sarah's the Sustainability Project Manager at Push, focusing on the Push for Clean Heat campaign. She graduated from Knox College with a degree in environmental studies. She worked with Rebuilding Together New Orleans for 6 years, learning how to renovate houses from the studs with a focus on insulating and air sealing older homes. Later, Sarah ventured into the commercial side of construction, working with architects, developers, and engineers to develop sustainable, affordable housing projects that use heat pumps and well-designed and constructed building envelopes to maximize comfort, reduce climate impacts, and minimize energy bills. And my question for you, Sarah, is what does it mean for a building to be heat pump ready? And how do the programs you're working on promote the message and support this approach to your members and in your community?
Sure. Hi. So one of the priorities that we have at Push is we want to make sure that when we're working with residents about converting their heating systems, that they're in the end not only comfortable and warm, but they don't have a higher energy burden. Utility bills are really expensive, and we want to make sure that we acknowledge that. Additionally, a lot of the repairs to make a building heat pump ready are also expensive. In New York, in Buffalo, I'm sorry, we have a really high amount of older buildings. And so one of the major things that might need to be upgraded before a heat pump is installed is the electrical service. There might not be enough amperage in the home. And so that is an additional cost that a lot of people don't necessarily anticipate. And there's not a lot of funding for. Additionally, I think I would argue a little bit about the need to insulate and air seal buildings when installing a heat pump. I might not have as much data as John though, but I think when we're thinking about these older homes that were built around 1900, most of them don't have insulation, or if they do, they're severely under insulated. A lot of them are balloon frames, so there's a significant amount of air leakage, especially into the attic. And so I think it's really important that we're looking at insulating these homes and addressing the air sealing needs. At Push, we try to make sure we have been educating homeowners about the need to insulate and air seal their homes. And that's a message that we've worked really hard to kind of teach people about, and they really understand. And so we don't want to just run away from that message and go to heat pumps. So what we're doing to kind of address this is our Push for Clean Heat campaign is working with Push Green, our energy efficiency branch, to make sure that we're kind of recommending the repairs hand in hand, and that we're trying to help LMI homeowners find the funding to do both. So there's that. The other thing we're doing right now is, as we're exploring how to electrify LMI homes, we're trying to figure out the best path that doesn't result in a spike in utility bills. And so we're currently conceptualizing a couple of pilot programs where we're going to take that opportunity to learn about the process of working with the homeowner to electrify their home and help alleviate some of their concerns, but then also making sure that we're monitoring utility costs so that in the end we don't end up with someone who has twice the utility bills but a heat pump in their house.
Thanks, Sarah. Important points. Let's turn back to Marvin at this point. Certainly the LMI communities are the folks that are going to be hit hardest. With climate change, it's very important we solve the climate change problem for that reason, and they're also the least able to afford many of the kind of things that we're talking about. So Marvin, tell me, what are some of the challenges you've noticed in getting LMI communities to come around to electric heat pumps? Marvin, you're on mute.
The challenges are different from the multifamily environment buildings versus the single family homes. And economic impact of COVID has raised the new challenges. Perhaps the single greatest challenge is financial, especially now that landlords are having difficulty getting their rents and homeowners may have lost their income. Our second challenge is the degree of complacency. People will continue doing what they've been used to unless they're forced otherwise. So unless there's hard deadlines that are declared, there will be some members of our community who will wait for the last possible moment to adopt new heating and heating strategies. Third challenge is a matter of priority. This is particularly acute during the pandemic. People have more vital things to attend to, like food, taking care of relatives, sick relatives, and rather than focusing on heating and cooling systems. We do not know the long-term impact on the pandemic and when there will be a full economic recovery and when our lives will turn back to normal. Fourth challenge is unfamiliarity with the heating and cooling system industry. This is easily overcome with a large-scale education to help residents understand how systems work and their benefits. Fifth challenge. This is going to be the Mikey challenge versus waiting to see who gets it first. People will wait to see if someone gets it first or whether it works or fails before they themselves get the new system. And finally, sixth challenge. This is the trust challenge. People are reluctant to buy something from someone they do not know or trust. This is particularly true in the single-family home housing market, where single greatest asset for a family is their home. They are unwilling to have someone tamper with their home if they do not know or trust those individuals. Those are the key ingredients I see that's the barrier and even some solutions for the LMI market.
Marvin, thank you. That reminds me, one of the great success stories we've had in the geothermal industry, and there have been many, has to do with a church in Lockport that had oil, very, very high oil bills and wasn't going to make it as a church. And there was a geothermal system installed there, and it basically saved on the operating costs enough that the church was able to survive. But past that, there have been so many congregation members at that church who are now going geo that it's just been remarkable. And the whole issue you brought up about people getting familiar and people gaining trust, I think that's a really good example of it. So let's at this point go back to John Schiavocco. And John, we have a kind of a broad question for you, but what are some of the challenges to widespread adoption of heat pumps?
Yeah, probably the biggest challenge when we have buildings and homes and commercial buildings that have combustion sources for heat is that much of that heat is distributed at high temperatures. There are hydronic systems, baseboard water, baseboard radiators, regular radiator steam systems. These are all things that aren't really what we'd call heat pump friendly. Heat pumps are pretty good at replacing air systems. So if there's a central air system, a heat pump can make sufficient heat often to replace that furnace, say in a home or a commercial building. if it's a water-based system, the water-based heat pumps really struggle once they get much above 120 or 130 degrees Fahrenheit delivery, and the systems often need 160 to 180, or steam is steam. You know, steam's much hotter. So that's the biggest challenge, I think, that we have, that the older building stock in much of New York State just has this very, very old and hot hydronic-based system. I think in the Albany area, the older building stock, it's a good 75 to 80% of it doesn't have a central ductwork system in the housing stock. So that's a big comeuppance, and it adds a lot of additional costs. So how do we get around that? One of the things is the ductless systems certainly become very popular. You know, so the ductless mini splits and variable refrigerant flow, which is the same basic technology, but usually on a larger scale, that gives us the ability to put energy where we need it on a room by room or space by space basis. It usually isn't quite as good as a central ductwork system in terms of really conditioning evenly, but it's pretty good, and usually a good trade-off. It's mostly considered an air source technology, but ground source or water source heat pumps also can access the same sort of mini split head VRF style systems. The maybe a bit of a trade-off on that is those have a lot more refrigerant per ton of capacity, but we have lots of things going on right now to try to get the negative impacts of refrigerants in better hands. So over time, I think that'll decrease as an issue. We also you can increase the amount of surface area on baseboard systems. We probably install ductwork on existing homes in maybe 25% of our retrofit projects that we do for air source and ground source systems. But that's a big additional expense, and it's something that we'll really have to get a handle on if we're going to be successful in converting homes to heat pumps. Back to you, Bill.
Thank you. Next question is for Donovan. And Donovan, what financing options are available right now for heat pumps in New York State?
Okay, thanks, Bill. I think there are lots of financing options. Obviously, the first one is if you have the money, you just pay for it. That doesn't apply to most people. Obviously, others, home improvement loans, but the interest rates are fairly high. Home equity loans, actually that's probably the best with the lowest interest rates. On the commercial side, you have PACE financing, credit unions. From a Nyserda standpoint, we have Green Jobs Green New York loan program, where the loans for market rate are competitive. It's a 6.99%, and for income eligible, it's 4.99. Some revisions were made to the program early this year, so it's sort of geo-targeted based on zip code. So once you submit an application based on the zip code, it automatically, if the majority of the residents within that zip code is income eligible, everybody gets that 4.99. And that covers about almost 70% of the residents in New York State. So the majority of the people that will apply to Nyserda's Green Job Green New York loan program will probably be eligible for the 4.99% interest rate. Other things that we're looking at now, as it relates to LMI, we're looking at ways to buy down the cost even more. So it's not financing, but here, one of the best ways to finance is incentives, right? So with the New York State Clean Heat, all the utilities have really robust incentives for heat pumps. We're looking now, and we'll probably be launching in the next month or two, additional support for LMI residents that further buys down the cost. So an additional incentive above the utility incentive. So hopefully we'll be able to talk about that in the coming weeks. Other things that I really want to start exploring. One is working with local banks, we call CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, community banks, to offer these clean energy loans to their local residents. Third-party ownership. Other than your heating, the boiler, that's about the only thing a resident owns. They don't own the infrastructure. For, let's say, particularly for geothermal, you're asked to buy the entire infrastructure. That's why the cost is high. But having a third party owning it and charging you a monthly fee is a really good way to bring the cost down. Innovative business models. I think who mentioned looking at these district, or I think Martin mentioned community style heat pump systems where a large owner owns a district system and becomes becomes a thermal utility. Next month, we're actually going to be launching a funding opportunity to explore these large-scale community systems. And there's some manufacturers that offer loan programs to their distributors. So it is sort of broad in terms of the financing opportunities. It's just which one works best for you, your financial situation, and obviously your credit worthiness. But I think long-term, the best is going to be third-party ownership, where it becomes a utility model. So you don't have a CapEx. You don't have to come out of pocket up front with these technologies. You just pay for usage as you go.
Thanks, Donovan. Great suggestions. I'm really excited to hear that there's additional LMI programming coming, and I hope people will stay on the lookout for that. I think that's going to be a really great addition. So we have one more question, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. And this question is for Sarah. Sarah, in addition to financing, what other resources should be available to homeowners? Can you talk about Push's one-stop shop model?
Sure. So Push right now we have Push Green that I mentioned. And what happens when someone approaches Push Green is they work with that homeowner to build a relationship. It was a little bit different pre-COVID, where they might go and talk to them directly and learn about, their family's needs and their concerns in their homes, and really just work on building that trust. And then the next thing they would do is they would get the homeowner signed up for an energy audit. And then depending on the homeowner's needs or concerns, they actually might be there during the energy audit to help explain some of that jargon, because energy audits are filled with jargon. And so just, having someone that they trust explain what that person is doing, why they might be testing their gas water heater, why they need to look where they do, is a big part of it. And then after that, they look at the programs that are offered, and they help they kind of guide the homeowner to the programs that would work for them. So instead of someone having to spend a lot of time researching each Nyserda program that's offered, Push Green just explains the offerings. They already know if the homeowner's income qualified for certain things as part of the discussion process. And so they can kind of just show the homeowner what they're offered. And then they will also work with the homeowner through those repairs to make sure that there aren't any concerns and that they're done correctly. And so when we're looking at this one-stop shop model, we're definitely hoping to expand this to heat pumps. We're still waiting for those LMI offerings to be public. We're really excited about those, Donovan. But that's one of the things that we want to make sure that we continue with our heat pump program. The other thing is, it's really important to not assume that people's time is free. And so streamlining application processes. So people might only have to fill out one short form to show that they're qualified, or to explain the details of their home. I know some programs are now starting to switch to this by, accepting a HEAP letter award as proof of income, but reducing the paperwork burden, I think, is really important. I think we sometimes think that if we're giving someone something at a reduced cost, then they should have to work really hard to get that thing, and we don't have endless amounts of free time. The other thing that we've kind of run across is people being worried about getting code enforcement called on their houses when they're having people come and do energy audits. And so I think making sure municipalities make it really clear that they're not using code enforcement to punish homeowners who are trying. That code enforcement is used to punish people, or not punish, but to make sure people are taking care of their properties that might be abandoned or something like that. But if a homeowner is actively working on their house, they shouldn't fear code enforcement. And I think just one quick thing about financing is I think we need to make sure that financing is not only available for the heat pump equipment itself, but for all those repairs that need to happen to make a building, you know, ready for a heat pump. So we need money for those electrical repairs. And then the last thing is we are also trying to tie in renewables to our offering. So making sure that we can connect people with meaningful community solar programs, and also to like try and look at ways that we can help fund getting solar panels on houses when they're getting heat pumps installed, so that there's not a huge utility burden. That is something that we are like just at the beginning stages of doing, and we're trying to figure out. So if anyone has ideas, let me know. But I think we really just want to make sure that we're really cognizant about how much things cost and how much people have.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. So I encourage folks to submit questions. That I'm getting the sense that we do not have questions. Maybe people are feeling shy or feeling like there's probably so many questions they shouldn't bother. But the lines are open for questions at this point. One that did come in is, what is LMI? And I'm usually a stickler for not using acronyms that people don't necessarily understand, but just so everybody does on that one, that's low and moderate income. And there are definitions for that put out by New York State and programs made available to folks in the LMI sector. Donovan, are you looking to talk here?
Yeah, I want to make a comment on that. Approximately a little over 50%, 50% of New York State's residents fall within the LMI category, the low to moderate income category. So we really need to address this segment if we want to decarbonize the state.
And you might be surprised. You might think that it doesn't apply to you, but really look into it. It applies to a lot of folks in the state. I know John had another point that he wanted to get to in terms of kind of market awareness of home builders and building owners.
Yeah, and so on the LMI thing quickly, I would say that Nyserda put a map together. So as a contractor, we can go and we can find those people that are eligible for that 3.49% very quickly. They're pre-qualified just because they're in a certain area. So that's a nice resource. The other point that I wanted to make was that right now we've got the CLCPA and we've got the milestones as we go towards 85% net carbon reduction by 2050. But the building sector, you know, there is, and I know it's challenging, but just recognize that if we air seal and insulated to 50% reduction in energy, we won't get anywhere as close to the greenhouse gas reduction goals that we need. So we have to electrify. We have to do it. And the only way that I can see it happening and why it's in such small percentages right now is that we need at some point some stepwise signals in the marketplace, like we've seen in other countries where a new building construction, you don't install a fossil fuel device. That needs to become part of what the building industry recognizes is coming and say that's 2025. Then existing buildings on replacement basically say you can't replace a fossil fuel system with a fossil fuel system. It needs to be something that is carbon neutral or no carbon. Those things might come later, say 2030, some date. We need to have those kinds of things out there. And then as we get towards 2045, we need to convert everything. And as the grid gets cleaner, those solutions that are installed now and between now and say 2030, 2025, those will only get cleaner as the grid gets cleaner. That's the goal. So we need to electrify the combustion sectors and buildings. And we really need to send out some kind of clear signal to the market so that everybody can get aligned and figure out how to make it work. Right now, it's really just open-ended with these big goals, but not a lot of motivation.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Bill. So looking at the rest of the world, and I totally agree that with you, John, that we have to electrify. I mean, ultimately we have to put heat pumps in. But this was, I think, from 2017, I get this report, that in Asia, 90% of all heating systems replaced are replaced with heat pumps. In Europe, 60%, 60% of heating systems replaced are with heat pumps. In the United States, 4% of heating systems replaced are with heat pumps. We just need to get with the rest of the world. So yes, and not everybody has the mandate. So huge education and consumer awareness and creating consumer demand, along with, yes, ultimately some of these mandates that you're requesting, but we really need more education, awareness, and consumer demand.
So we are starting to get some questions, and this one I believe stems from something Donovan said. You mentioned the third-party ownership of HVAC equipment. What would need to change at the Public Service Commission level to implement this through the utilities and/or private sector players?
Well, for the utilities, it's fair. I mean, it's an order, but the appetite to create another utility is not there right now. They are doing some pilots. I think National Grid did a pilot. They're asking for another one. Con Ed has been granted funding to do a pilot of these district systems in Westchester. For the private sector, it really is the return, the IRR, the internal rate of return, and getting the economics right. The tax code right now, it worked for solar because solar on the residential side, they had a 30% tax credit. I think this year was 26%, but also on the commercial side. For geothermal, it's the same as solar on the residential side for this year, 26%, but 10% for commercial. So if we can get comparable tax credits, federal tax credits on the geothermal side as equivalent to what solar is, that could spark third-party ownership. So that could be one thing. And another thing, lastly, which could possibly happen next year, we hope, if there's an infrastructure bill passed where there's funding for states and local municipalities to upgrade their infrastructure, their pipes, their sewers, their water mains, their roads. As you tear up your roads and your infrastructure, you can put down these geothermal ambient loops and start, these clean thermal utilities. So it'd be a combination of all, but the silver bullet is not going to be DPS saying utilities go and doing it. The economics have to be right. So the cost of the infrastructure needs to come down and be economic.
Thank you. Another really important question that has come in is the goal to have all heating and cooling be done with electricity? If so, has anyone considered the electric generation that would be needed to accomplish this in the winter when heating loads are the greatest? I see John shaking his head.
Yep.
And Donovan's ready to.
Yeah, well,
we think about that a lot, and I know Donovan does too. Do you have an answer, Donovan?
Well, okay, so we are looking at and studying the grid impact. It's not an imminent issue because the grid is designed for cooling right now. Peak is defined as the hottest day of the year when everyone has the air conditioner on. On an annual basis, the grid operates about 54% capacity because it's designed for the hottest day of the year when everyone has the air. So during the winter, there is a lot of capacity. Now, that can be sucked up very quickly once the penetration of heat pumps reaches a certain level, certainly when it gets to double digits, but it's like 2-3% right now. So you've got a couple of years, but you're absolutely right. We're thinking about that, and it's going to be mitigated with some on-site, with storage, and even more efficient heat pumps, even though they're the most efficient HVAC systems on the planet right now. John, you're welcome to add to what.
Yeah, just quickly on that, the New York ISO, the Independent System Operator, does forecast. Their forecast for 2020 was radically different than their 2019 forecast because they started to really look at the implications of the CLCPA and electrifying both buildings and transportation. Where's that coming from? So, and that will actually come from buildings. We'll plug these vehicles in near buildings mostly. So they're going to be attached to that in some ways. They show that there's a crossover point probably somewhere 2035, 2040 or so where the summer peak, the winter peak overcomes the summer peak. So it's a little ways off for sure as we go down the path. But then once we get past that, we might need twice as much, at least twice as much electricity at the new winter peak than we have present on the grid with the current summer peak, which is a mouthful of things to say. And I have to say that all of that will change so much between now and then, but it is the kind of thing we need to prepare for and do lots of modeling around and then get everybody motivated to try to minimize that additional capital cost that we need, because we not only need more clean electricity, we need just more electricity. So we want to minimize that by putting the most efficient electric systems in, and it'll have a lot to do with controls and how we do ventilation. So that it's complicated, but we all need to shoulder it.
So another very interesting question just came in, which is, in many cases, there are leak-prone pipes going into neighborhoods, and it costs a lot of money to fix those leak-prone pipes. That might be a really good opportunity to get the neighborhood together and to have a neighborhood solution be to move to heat pumps and not to spend the money on the leak-prone pipes. The question in relation to that is, how do we require utilities to notify municipalities so that those neighborhoods can be targeted for heat pumps, possibly even municipally owned ground loops?
I know lots about that, but so does Donovan.
Go ahead.
We haven't been hearing from Sarah or Marvin either.
That's
you all
great.
have the first dibs on any questions you want to come to as well. But
so I'm an advisor for a group called HEAT. It's HEET in the Boston area that you can look up. But that's their premise, is that there's billions and billions of dollars of leak-prone pipe replacement in Massachusetts, and they are saying, let's not put in new pipe, let's put in district geothermal systems, little micro districts of water source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, to electrify those areas instead of repair that. And I think that in New York, we have what are called non-pipes alternatives or non-pipeline alternative programs that are showing up with each utility through their rate cases and through certain mechanisms called earnings adjustment mechanisms that incent the utility to look at solutions like that. It's still a big challenge, though. If someone has access to natural gas in New York, it's relatively inexpensive to create heat. And so even the most efficient electrification solutions kind of get you about cost neutral, as long as the utility could bear some of that cost, or we find third-party providers to put those in. And that'll be a big focus and work hand in hand with the communities program that Donovan's putting together, I think.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. That's what we're trying to see if we can get some solutions for. The big question mark, though, on this is the cooking. We may solve the heating, but a lot of people still like to use their gas stove for cooking.
Thanks, Donovan. In relation to that, the same folks at HEAT that John was mentioning did a webinar recently. It was a cook-off. And one of the board members had a gas stove, the other had an induction stove. And they both made the same meals on each, and it was pretty interesting. The induction stove owner loves her stove. We've got another question here. How are the many programs targeting climate emissions in New York State synergized? Do they work together? And are they coordinated?
Well, we're trying to coordinate as best we can. So all of the incentives for heat pumps are now run through the utilities. They created, through DPS, they would call it Joint Management Committee. That's a committee chaired by a person on my team and one of the utilities to make sure that there's coordination and exchange of information between Nyserda and the utilities, and that we are really close to each other in the management of this. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we're managing the market development plan, which is marketing, outreach, workforce development, some of these community programs and other initiatives that we're doing. So we want to make sure that we coordinate that with them, so with the utilities. So under this New Efficiency New York and this New York State Clean Heat programs, we are doing our best, between the DPS, Nyserda, and utilities to try to be on the same page as best as possible in coordination and communications with the stakeholders, because I know, Bill, you with New York GO talks to this Joint Management Committee on a regular basis. So we're really trying to have an open line of communication across all parties.
Great. I want to thank our panelists. You all did a great job disciplining yourself to keep to the times that we had in mind. And I think it's been a really productive session. I see there are other questions coming in. We'll try to get to them at some point, but at this point, we want to come in under time, and we're turning the floor back over to Julie Tai from the New York League of Conservation Voters.
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to all of our panelists. I want to thank everyone who joined us this morning. We hope that you learned a few new things about our buildings and how we can green them. Personally, I know my house in Albany is built in 1853, so it similarly has energy efficiency challenges. Fortunately, I do have electric. Quite certain it's not the most efficient electric, but we'll get there. Thank you again to our partners, Saban Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, our sponsors, AECOM and Con Edison, and to all of our panelists for this great discussion today. If you tuned in late or you want to rewatch, this video will be also available on our YouTube page at youtube.com/NYLCV. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second in our series on the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, so stay tuned for more forums like this. But please follow us on at NYLCV on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram for updates. You can also subscribe to our YouTube page. And if you're not already on our email list, sign up at www.nylcvef.org. And given where we are in the time of year, I would strongly encourage people to vote. The election is on November 3rd. Here in New York, we have early voting that starts on October 24th, and we are encouraging people to vote early and take our Vote Early pledge this year. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and have a great day.
Perhaps we can save the chat